Well, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Astronomical Society of Edinburgh's March meeting. I'm Neil Martin, current president of the Society. I'd like to extend an especially warm welcome to our guest speaker for this evening, Bill Barton. I'll introduce Bill properly in a moment. And to continue the warm welcomes, our latest new members are Malcolm Thompson and Alex West. And that brings our membership to 227, pending Alan's membership renewal review, which will happen next month. So are either Malcolm or Alex with us in the room this evening or online? If you are, make yourself known to us. Can't see any hands in the room, so nevertheless, let's make our new friends welcome by giving them the usual welcome to the Society. And if you're joining us on Zoom, now is the moment when I ask you to pop yourself on mute. And now is also the moment where I congratulate those in the room for making it here, braving something. And this month, it is the hordes of French rugby supporters. So well done if you made it through the tram or the bus or however you got here, well done. So our topics for this evening are my very quick introductions before I introduce Bill properly. Following Bill's talk and the Q&A, we'll take a look at the sky in March, and it's presented this month by David Brett. We'll finish up with my look ahead to what's coming soon, before we serve up tea, coffee, biscuits and chat for those in the room. And you know the drill by now. If you're at home, it's self-service. We've got some approximate timings here. We'll try and stick to those, but I think we've got a pretty good, clear agenda. And having said that, that's bound to have jinxed it. So let's see how we go. So let me quickly conclude my introductions for this evening by summarising our online resources available. Our website has a varied collection of public materials and a members area, which I'll get to in a second. That contains details of our project activities and a lot more. Our YouTube channel and Flickr groups contain collections of video and images, including meeting recordings. And we regularly publish on social media platforms, some social media platforms, using these handles. So look out for those. And within the Society, for our member community, we have our newsletter and our active community containing lots of WhatsApp groups. So never a dull moment when you're a member. On the subject of members groups, we also have a monthly imaging and observing group. This meets around about the same time as this main meeting, and it's obviously for members only. And this group runs our Image of the Quarter and Image of the Year competitions, and this is our reigning Image of the Year, a huge solar prominence imaged in hydrogen alpha by Rob Parsons. And that's the backdrop to my presentations for this calendar year. So if you're not currently a member but are interested in hearing more, including information about ASRO, our remote observatory in Spain, or you want to discuss imaging and observing, you want to take part in the projects, you want to create some prize-winning images of your own, then these are the basic details you need. Lots of benefits to becoming a member, as I've tried to cover there, and the cost is incredible value at £32 or less than £3 a month, and it's half that if you qualify for our concessions rate. Full details are available on our website at astronomyedinburgh.org/membership. So now it's time to focus on our main talk this evening, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Bill Barton. Now, Bill took early retirement from his position as a signal engineer with Network Rail in 2014 after 35 years service. He joined the British Astronomical Association in 1983 and contributed to their solar section between 1990 and, as I like to call it, the turn of the century, 2000. However, on that theme, history has always had a strong calling for Bill. And in 2002, He was a founder member of the Society for the History of Astronomy. In the same year, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. 2003 saw Bill licensed to operate the Orwell Park refractor on behalf of the Orwell Astronomical Society, which he had joined several years earlier. And he's now a trustee of that society. In January 2020, he was appointed as the Deputy Director of the British Astronomical Association Historical Section. Bill has a particular soft spot for classic telescopes, don't we all? He owns some astronomical antiques and a large collection of old astronomy books. So tonight's talk is sure to be compelling. Please welcome Bill Barton.
Thank you very much. Yes, in the historical section of the BAA, we're not like the other sections. We don't look through telescopes at things. We visit archives and places of historical interest to draw out stories from the past. And so this evening's presentation is on the biggest telescope in the world. I'd like to take you back to the 1830s, 1840s. And it was around that time in astronomy that there were two principal theories as to the formation and the existence of the universe. And the two theories met over these objects called nebulae. Some people said they were only star clusters. And if you didn't have a big enough telescope, you couldn't resolve them into individual stars. Other people said, no, they're gas clouds in space. If they were stars, then stars were thought to be very long-lived, possibly the same lifespan as the universe. So there'd been a creation event, and the universe was fixed and unchanging. The creation event could have been biblical. The people who supported the gas clouds said, these things are obviously dynamic. It's very easy to imagine gravity taking control of a gas cloud and pulling it around, maybe collapsing it, maybe it does form a star eventually. They didn't know back then, but so nebulae were the hot subject in astronomy. And what were they? Were they gas clouds or were they actually groups of stars? So, if you look at a star cluster through a telescope, you might see some stars, you might not. You get a bigger telescope, you get greater resolving power. So what was a fuzzy patch in a small telescope turns into a star cluster in a bigger scope. So perhaps the answer to what the nebulae were was a huge, humongously big telescope. And so we come to this chap, the third Earl of Rosse, born in 1800, and he got interested in astronomy in the 1820s, while he was actually Member of Parliament for Kings County, at this point in history, the whole of Ireland was ruled from Westminster. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. And so he envisaged a very large telescope that would solve the riddle of what the nebulae were. And as you can see, he was not only a fellow of the RAS, he was a fellow of the Royal Society, which is still this country's senior scientific society, and he was actually president as well. So this kind of gives you an idea. He was at the very top of maybe not aristocracy, but certainly scientific aristocracy. And his ideas of astronomy was that the knowledge of the solar system was virtually complete. There were one or two little things where we didn't quite know what the answers were, but generally we could answer any question that would be posed about the solar system. There was no point in doing any more work on the planets because we knew all the answers. But the nebulae and also double stars interested him because it was an area where he felt there was still work to be done. So, as was probably quite popular back then, he was homeschooled by his parents and paid for tutors. He went to Trinity College, Dublin, went on the first day of term, collected all the textbooks and the teaching material, went back to his home and was self-taught, and his parents and the tutors taught him as well. And he went back to Trinity College, Dublin, just to do the exam. So after Dublin, he went on to Magdalen College, Oxford, and very much his academic equivalent was a younger brother, John, who was 3 years younger than him, but say they were certainly on a par educationally. Unfortunately, the younger brother died in 1828 of tuberculosis, and that really did affect the third Earl of Ross. It was a big shock to the family. So they lived at Birr Castle. This is a modern image of the castle, and it is right in the middle of Ireland. You might regard that as a scientific backwater. It's certainly quite away from Dublin, which had a Royal Academy at the time, but you are essentially there free to pursue questions and work to your own satisfaction. I need to mention his wife, the Countess of Ross. She was a Yorkshire heiress. So while he had the title, she came with the wallet full of money. She bankrolled a lot of his experiments, so she's as important as he is. She had to do this while bearing him some 13 children. Unfortunately, I should say, at this point in history, women had very little control over their fertility, and you often find wives in a virtually continual state of pregnancy. So as I said, she was independently wealthy. She brought money into the family. She was also a wonderful artist, both in watercolours and the new technology of photography. So you don't just build the biggest telescope in the world straight off. You try and build up to it, build up some experience, get some experiments done, get some knowledge into your head. So they started off with a 3-foot aperture telescope, completed in the late 1830s, and it is very similar to William Herschel's 4-foot telescope, 48-inch, that he had at Slough. So it's using 19th century naval technology, wooden spars, block and tackle, pulleys, and people pulling on ropes to move it around. Essentially an altazimuth mounted instrument, but it was reworked in 1874 as an equatorial. Unlike William Herschel, the Earl of Ross built these telescopes as Newtonian reflectors. He put a flat in the aperture and the eyepiece was on the side. He felt that the front view that William Herschel favoured wasn't particularly good, because you ended up with your head in the aperture of the telescope. Warm air would rise and destroy the image quality. If you stood at the side, the telescope would be pointing unimpeded at the night sky. The Earl of Rosse started making these telescopes using metal mirrors, and to make the mirror making easier, he actually built them up in segments. But he discovered that no matter how well engineered the joints were between the segments, they always degraded the image, and so you would have to build the mirror in one single piece. So in 1843, they felt ready to try and construct a 6-foot diameter mirror. It was made of speculum metal, which is a combination of copper and tin. The Earl of Rosse had to find this out all for himself. Previous people who'd made metal reflecting telescopes had very little been published on actually how you did it, and everybody had almost to start from square one every time. The only fuel available in Central Ireland was peat, and believe it or not, you can get enough temperature out of peat fires to actually melt copper and tin. So the process was to put the cold metal ingots onto the furnace, heat them up till they melted, and then pour them into a mould. The first one, the cast was successful, but of course what you've got now is a 6-foot diameter disc of metal. It wants to cool from the outside first. Material on cooling contracts, but the middle of the mirror is still warm and comparatively big. You set up stresses within the disc of metal. And so it's very easy for the metal just to crack, because speculum metal is very fragile. So the only thing you can do is to, once you've got the mirror cast into a disc, is to put it into a thing called an annealing oven. You cool it down extremely slowly. So the first mirror went into the annealing oven, and it was in there for 6 weeks. Peat foil poured on, kept the thing warm, very, very slowly cooling down. It came out of the annealing oven, it went onto the machine to be ground to get a good optical surface on the front, and after 4 weeks of grinding, it broke. First one was a failure. The second one went into the annealing oven, and it was there for 16 weeks. This was followed by 8 weeks of grinding and polishing. So this isn't stuff in a hurry. It weighed 4 tons, and it made a successful mirror. But of course, one mirror isn't particularly useful in an instrument like this, because the speculum metal tarnishes, and every so often you have to take the mirror out of the telescope, repolish it and put it back in again. You need at least 2 mirrors really, so you've got one in and one being worked on. The third casting, well, that cracked straight through the middle. The fourth one is said to have exploded in the annealing oven. It just fell to pieces. But cast number 5, again, produced a satisfactory mirror, but it only weighed 3.5 tons. So number 2, although it was the better mirror, tarnished quickly because they'd used rather higher concentration of copper than they were hoping to use. Number 5 was a good mirror, but because of the weighed less, it was actually rather flexible. And when it was in the telescope, it distorted under its own weight. And of course, if you know anything about Irish history, 1843, we are getting very close to the potato famine, which started in 1845 and ran through to 1852. So just at the time when the Earl of Rosse is getting his big telescope into action, it then more or less has to be mothballed, and the family have to do what they can to deal with the potato famine. Basically, the family had parts of the castle knocked down to give the estate workers something to do to rebuild them. So the telescope was mounted on a universal joint that stood between two masonry walls that were aligned to the meridian, north-south. The walls were 71 feet long and 40 feet high and 23 feet apart. So the way that the telescope would be used was the telescope was swung over to the eastern wall. You adjusted the altitude for what you hoped the object you were interested in that night came along. There wasn't actually a finder scope for this instrument. All they had was a very low power eyepiece, an eyepiece of something like 6 inches focal length. You put that in, you saw the object coming along, you adjusted the altitude of the instrument, you put a high power eyepiece in. And then you could follow the object as it crossed the meridian for about an hour. So when one mirror was tarnished, you swapped it over with the other one, and then you used that one until that one tarnished. They seem to have been very reticent about polishing the mirrors, almost to the extent that when the 72-inch mirrors needed a polish, they actually polished the 36-inch mirror first, just to make sure they knew how to do it, and then they tried it on the big ones. So when it came into use in February 1845, it was definitely the biggest telescope in the world. The previous biggest telescope had been William Herschel's 48-inch, and it remained the biggest until 1917, when the 100-inch on Mount Wilson came into use, although this telescope wasn't really used after 1890. There was a British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in York in September 1845. The Earl of Rosse was there, and he came along with this thing, a 1/24th scale model of the telescope, and he also brought along models of the equipment that he'd used to polish the mirror. He knew that a 72-inch mirror that weighed 4 tons, you weren't going to be able to polish that or grind it by hand, so he had steam-powered machinery to do the work for him. And it was said that the room where the meeting was held was crowded to suffocation, and every seat was taken long before the talk started, and many people could not gain admittance. So this 1/24th scale model, this is something like a 3-inch aperture here. And I believe this model actually ended up in the Science Museum, so it does still exist. So you can see the two masonry walls, the tube of the telescope, and then these ladders and galleries are what you had to climb to get to the eyepiece, because the telescope tube was some 50 feet long. It could more or less go down to the southern horizon. It could go up to the zenith and a little bit beyond the zenith, but there was a blind spot near the celestial pole that the telescope couldn't reach. So here are some of Earl of Rosse's state workers, and I believe this chap that sat in the middle is actually one of his paid astronomers, and that's one of the 72-inch diameter mirrors. And again, this is probably, this is the illustration which has been used to advertise the talk. And you can see that there's a chain attached to the top of the telescope that went to a counterweight at the back, and so that it was reasonably stable on its own, but you still needed people pulling things on windlasses to actually get the telescope into position. This is a back view of the telescope, so you can see the castle where they lived. That's the 3-foot telescope, and this is the rear of the 72-inch. You can see one of the mirrors there, and the other thing you can see is this iron rail on the eastern wall. So this is the thing that the telescope sat up against when the object came into view, and then it was actually pushed off that rail. There's the object, and the telescope moved westward, telescope tracking the object. Perhaps surprisingly, they actually looked at the moon through this instrument and were able to make drawings of some lunar craters. And there's another one. But the way they used the 72-inch to look at nebulae was to actually look at the nebula through the 36-inch to start with. They used a micrometer to accurately plot the position of the field stars. And when you've got a drawing with dots all over it as to where the field stars were, you then took that to the 72-inch and you drew in the nebula that you could see from there. Because that was all you could do with this telescope. You could only follow an object for an hour, and it was essentially an outhouse mounted instrument. You couldn't really take photographs through the instrument. Everything that they observed was essentially an artistic impression of the object. So Messier 42, the Orion Nebula, because that's a prime candidate. It's a large nebula, it's a bright nebula. And over the years that the telescope was used, Lord Rosse thought that changes had occurred in the nebula, and he thought they were getting close to resolving all of this actually into stars. Because the telescope had 2 different mirrors, and because you've got, when the telescope was first used, shall we say they were inexperienced in what they were seeing. Obviously they were learning as they were using it, so maybe change didn't occur, and maybe they weren't close to resolving it into stars. Talk now about the 4th Earl of Rosse. So this is the 3rd Earl's son. He was born at Burghcastle in 1840, and like his father, he was both a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Society. He too was interested in astronomy, but he had no interest in the nebulae. He was completely focused on this, at the time, entirely academic question of how hot the surface of the moon was. Why he concentrated on this one question and the whole of astronomy, I really don't know. So he attached a thermocouple to the 36-inch telescope and pointed it at the moon. And the first result, he said, well, it's over double boiling point of water. He then sort of sat down and had a think, because he'd got nothing to compare this with. He got no idea what the errors were in the instrument. And then the second result, he said, well, it's slightly under the boiling point of water. That was the answer that he settled on. But of course, nobody else was doing this work. He was entirely on his own. And at the time, his results weren't accepted. But one method he had of kind of proving, illustrating that he was correct, was to wait for an eclipse of the moon and take the same measurements. And when the moon passed into the Earth's shadow, he could show a very great fall in the temperature of the surface of the moon. And that meant that the surface of the moon was being heated by the sun and not internal heat from the moon. So here's the 36-inch remounted as an equatorial. And as we know, health and safety was only invented in 1980, which they didn't have back then in the 19th century. The observer climbed into this bucket when the crane was on the ground, and the state workers winched you up into position, and so you could follow the eyepiece of the telescope at the top here as the telescope moved on its equatorial mounting. And there is the thermopile that was used to measure the heat of the surface of the moon. In the 19th century, rich gentlemen paid for an observatory, paid for a telescope, but they very rarely looked through it themselves. You paid somebody to look through the telescope. And so there was a chap called George Bishop who unbelievably had an observatory in Regent's Park in central London. He employed an astronomer called John Russell Hind. Charles Grover was employed by Sir Cuthbert Peake in Devon. My own example at Orwell Park in Suffolk, the observatory was owned by Colonel George Tomlin, and he employed John Isaac Plummer to look through the telescope. And lastly, E.J. Cooper employed Andrew Graham. And so these paid-for astronomers would write annual reports that were submitted to the RAS and printed in monthly notice, so we know what kind of work they were doing. But the only other employment in astronomy at this time for these kind of people was to work at either a university observatory or Greenwich Observatory, or maybe the Royal Observatory here in Edinburgh. Being a gentleman's astronomer, you would probably get twice or maybe 4 times the pay that you could get in government service, but you paid the risk that your employer, in the case of Orwell Park, the employer died and the next generation weren't interested in astronomy, and John Isaac Plummer got the sack. Alternatively, your employer could lose interest in astronomy, so you got the sack. And of course, what the employer believed about astronomy, you'd probably better believe yourself, because you're not going to get far if you fall out with your employer. So the observatory at Burgh Castle, perhaps being one of the most well-endowed private observatory, certainly had the biggest telescope. They also had the largest number of paid-for observers. Some of these men kind of doubled up as the tutors to the 3rd Earl of Ross's children. So there's people like Robert Ball, who was there in the 1860s. He then went on to become Astronomer Royal for Ireland and hold a university position in Cambridge. We have Mr. Dreyer. He's the person who wrote the New General Catalogue. He didn't actually do it using the telescopes at Burgh Castle. He just sat in the apartments at the Royal Astronomical Society and went through other people's observing records to find the definitive list of nebulae in the night sky. And the last one was a chap called Otto Bodecker, He was actually a German national, and although he stopped being paid as an astronomer in 1908, he stayed on until the First World War broke out, and then he had to return to his native country because he was an illegal alien. One of Boedecker's achievements at Burgh Castle, he had the 72-inch telescope, the biggest telescope in the world at his disposal. What did he do? He sat next to it with a sketch pad and he sketched the Milky Way by naked eye. Why he chose to do that, I don't know. And it wasn't until last year when I visited the Norman Lockyer Observatory down in Devon, I couldn't believe my eyes. There, laid on the table, was Boedecker's portfolio of the Milky Way. And they are absolutely beautiful drawings, but they are just that, drawings. Why he even chose to use a pencil and paper when he could have used a camera and photographed, I don't know, but there we are. So there were two 72-inch mirrors at Burgh Castle, and in 1914, one of them was donated to the Science Museum, and we've got no idea what happened to the other mirror. It's not exactly an easy thing to lose, a 6-foot diameter disc of metal, but there we are. So what did they discover using this biggest telescope in the world? Well, one of the objects they looked at was this thing we now call the Crab Nebula, M1. And it's actually down to the Earl of Rosse, the third Earl of Rosse. He came up with the name Crab Nebula. This is one of the early drawings of it. Later drawings look substantially different. And there was a period when the Earl of Rosse was actually calling this the Pineapple Nebula. It looks much more like a pineapple than a crab. But of course, what they discovered was a good deal of the nebulae had a spiral pattern. That was the big discovery made at Burgh Castle. Of course, they didn't know what these spirals were because they didn't know how far away these objects were. Maybe they were close at hand and they were solar systems in formation, or maybe they were further away and something else. They didn't really know about island universes, shall we say, external galaxies at this time. It was down to later astronomers to actually work out the distance to these objects. And of course, the answer to resolving the nebulae is not a bigger telescope, but to make better use of the light that you receive. And it was William Huggins in London who attached a spectroscope to his telescope. And depending on what you're looking at as to what the answer is that comes out the back of the eyepiece. So the top one here is the kind of image you get from a star, a continuous spectrum from red to blue, crossed by dark lines of absorption in the star's atmosphere. The gaseous nebulae, on the other hand, consisting only of, say, hydrogen or helium, emits at those same specific wavelengths, and you get bright lines on a dark background. Huggins was used to seeing this kind of thing because he was used to using his spectroscope on stars. The first nebula he looked at, he got this. He suspected his spectroscope was broken. There was a defect in the equipment giving him an incorrect answer. And then he had the eureka moment. No, what I'm looking at is actually a gas cloud in space, which is why it has separate lines like this. And so that cannot be a star cluster, it has to be a gas cloud. I can't finish this talk without talking about this chap, Charles Parsons. So he's got the same family name as the Earls of Rosse, but he's not actually a direct in line of succession. He's born in London in the 1850s. He gets even more awards, and he is the inventor of the steam turbine. Except he's not the inventor of the steam turbine because he actually invented it twice. The first time he invented it was when he was working for a company, and the company got a patent. He left the company, couldn't do any work on the steam turbine because the company had the patent. So he reinvented the steam turbine outside the clauses of the patent. And so coming now to the end of the talk, it was when Patrick Moore was director of a planetarium in Armagh in Ireland that he visited Birr Castle and was rather surprised to find that all the records of the telescope were still on site, stored away in the archives and the cupboards and storerooms and what have you in the castle. So in 1971, he produced this book, The Astronomy of Birr Castle, which tells the story. And then in the mid-1990s, the current Earl of Rosse at the time decided it would be an idea to try and get the telescope back into operation. They employed Michael Tubridy, who was an engineer, and he had to start off work basically as an archaeologist because the tube was still there, but the pit that it sat in the ground had been allowed to fill up over the years, and he had to start digging down, and he found all the bits underground that were still there. The tube was still more or less intact. It's a wooden tube surrounded by iron hoops. The tube was repaired, the galleries were repaired. They had a new mirror made for the telescope, but it seems that the people they commissioned to make the mirror never got the message that this telescope works out of doors, and so the mirror was put in the telescope and it very quickly degraded. So it was briefly possible to use the telescope in the late 1990s, but unfortunately now, although it's still there and it has been renovated, it's not in usable condition at the moment. And so to come to the end of the talk, this telescope was built by the grandest of grand amateurs. Yes, it was technically limited, but it was as big a telescope as the third Earl of Rosse could make. The third Earl of Rosse was the sort of person, I don't know if they exist anymore, but he was a person of independent income, and so he didn't need to get out of bed in the morning, shall we say. He was free to do with his time what he wished, and he was really an engineer. He wasn't really an astronomer. He liked making things, and if they didn't work, he liked to work on them till he could get them to work to his satisfaction. One of the stories about Birr Castle is that the family built a steam car because they could. Petrol technology had not yet come along, but steam technology was there. You could build a little steam engine, put it on something with four wheels, and have a little run around the town square on an afternoon just for your enjoyment. Unfortunately, the steam car was involved in an accident, and it would seem that the family was so distraught about this accident that they completely disassembled the steam car, got rid of all the pieces, and it's the only object at Birr Castle at this time that there are no photographs of. Countess of Rosse was a great photographer. If you stood still long enough, you take a photograph of you anyway. And it would seem that if there were photographs, which almost certainly there were, they were also all destroyed. So it is also said of the Earl of Rosse that he was only actually interested in building this big telescope. He just wanted to build a telescope, a really big telescope, and maybe look through it once or twice. And it's said at the time that when the last nail was hammered home, that's when the Earl of Rosse lost interest in the instrument. But it did make fundamental discoveries, not what the nebulae were, but the fact that some of the nebulae were spiral in nature, and so they had to be something other than just a gas cloud. And at that point, I'd like to complete my talk.
Thank you so much, Bill, for a fascinating talk. I love hearing about how people built things in the past. And when you said that the telescope had been moved from alt-az to equatorial, I gasped, because I struggle to equatorial align my tiny smart scope. So it was fascinating to hear that. So thank you very much. And let's open the floor to questions.
Thanks very much. I was wondering why they used metal for the lenses rather than glass.
So yes, a modern reflecting telescope would use a glass mirror with a silvered surface or aluminium surface. That technology came along in the 1860s, so it's not really around. Why nobody thought of it earlier, I really don't know. It's kind of the existing technology, and people just went with it.
Thank you. You talked about the telescope being moved around by pulley, like on a ship with pulleys and ropes and such like. So presumably they needed a team to get the azimuth set for the evening. Did they need a team of people to track the stars across during the observation? You said they could track something for an hour. Did that require people to manually move it across, a team of people?
Now the elevation, yes, you needed 2 or 3 estate workers on winches. And I should say that the whole of the work on these telescopes was just done by estate workers. That they started with a small telescope and built up their skill level and their knowledge and their experience until they were able to build the biggest telescope in the world. As far as tracking the object as it moved across the sky, that was apparently done using a small crank handle at the eyepiece. The instrument in azimuth was extremely well balanced, but it was out of balance in the other way. And so, yes, it was quite easy to follow the object for about an hour until you got up against the other wall.
Will, if you're reading me, are there any questions from the YouTube audience?
Yep. Fantastic talk. There was one question from one of our regulars, Zapfan. I know you touched about the grinding of the mirror, but he wonders if you could just enlarge on how did they actually grind the speculum mirror?
So they used steam-powered machinery. I believe they used what you would call an undersized tool, so not another 6-foot disc, but a smaller tool to do the basic grinding of the mirror. And then the polishing was done using a pitch lap, which would have been standard amateur practice in the 20th century as well. The Earl of Rosse, I say, was really an engineer. And the final polish was done using jeweler's rouge. But he found it didn't give a good enough polish. So he went back a step and he looked at jeweler's rouge. And he invented a new method of making it, which gave a finer particle size, which gave him the polish he wanted, which then went back into the jewellery business as the way to make rouge.
Fantastic.
We have had one question on YouTube. On Zoom, Ian Smith was asking about the focal length.
So the focal length was basically 50 feet.
Fantastic, Bill. Thank you again for
You're
your
welcome.
presentation and for us answering all our questions. Let's thank Bill again, please. Push that back. Thank you. Okay, next up, it's time to hear about what to look for in the sky in March. So I'll invite David to come up and we'll just get started.
Just on there and here is fine. If not, I can just turn around, that's all right. Okay, lovely, thank you. Okay, the sky this month for March, the link to the main ASC sky this month is that QR code, because I thought that's actually got a lot of good information in it and a few things, or many things that I won't go through here. So I've put that up so it's nice and clear, so anyone wants to grab that now. So this month we're losing more and more darkness. So just as the clouds clear, we may have a few clear nights, the amount of darkness we get is going to drop substantially. So we're starting the month with around 9 hours of true night. And then we're ending with, I think that says six and a half or thereabouts. So not great. We've also got the step forward, which is the discontinuity there for the change in times. Here's the stuff for the moon. Now, I've linked in here the clair-obscur effects from Mary McIntyre's. It's a PDF link that if you'd like to use that for things like the lunar X and V, which in I think for this month is first quarter on the 25th. These are not reading glasses. Around the 25th of this month, you'll get the lunar X and V. I'm not going to go over any more stuff for the moon because the QR code is there and I don't have anything else to say on it. In terms of the planets this month, so there's not an awful lot available, certainly not an awful lot easily available. Jupiter's the main star at the moment, also very, very easy to find in the sky, more or less the brightest thing you'll see that doesn't flicker. In terms of the others, whilst Mars is crossed out there, technically you probably could catch it, but it's very close to the Sun. Same for Saturn and Neptune. Uranus is visible, and I think is near the Pleiades this month. It's in a later slide. And Venus, I believe, just after sunset is visible. It's always the brightest thing you can see once that's gone down. And Mercury, also visible if you know where to look. In terms of, this is the 21st of March, 6 in the morning. So Mercury is around 6 degrees above the horizon, just prior to the sun rising. So if you look in the right place, you'll be able to see it. Mars is in there as well. You might be able to see it. I think you'd struggle. But if you've got your telescope aligned from the night before, and you get Nina to go to it, to locate it, then you'll probably see it through the camera. And for Venus, this is the same day, but 7 in the evening. It'll be the bright object just above and to the left of the setting sun. Okay, going over the stuff that we can see, basically, Jupiter. I was having a play with WinJupos when I was putting this together. It's a very useful tool. You can open up an ephemerides display, and you can fast forward time and see what the moons do and see where they are. And it just so happened, I noticed on the 26th at about 7:30 in the evening, you've got a nice view where you should be able to see the spot with Ganymede just to the side of it, and the shadow of Io off to the side, the smaller moon there. So I thought that would be interesting if anybody wants to have a go at trying to capture that. And in terms of what's going on with Jupiter itself, here we've got an image in the bottom right by Matt Finch, which shows the shadow of a moon. This is taken with a relatively small Mac, I think. And then Mark's image, he's been following off and on this oval BA, or the little red spot. I don't know whether you would catch that in the eyepiece. I suspect if you've got very good eyes, maybe you would. But certainly with a camera, you'll be able to see it if you catch the right time. It's been around for a while. So again, if you're using WinJupos and you look on that, the planet rotates about every 9 or 10 hours. So you won't have to fast forward it much. You'll be able to see where that is and work out at what times that's visible for you. At the moment, it's visible above 3 sort of other smaller white storms and tracks around the belts. And I bunged that on because I was so pleased with it. I managed to get a little image of Ganymede took separately. So if you can get your telescope focused enough and pointed at some of the moons, you may be able to pick them up as more than just a pixel or two. Anyway, always a good target with the eyepiece as well as the camera. And as mentioned previously, the only other really truly night visible planet is Uranus. You should be able to find that relatively easily if you look for the Pleiades and track down. It makes a sort of triangle with Aldebaran. Right. The next and last bits of this, I didn't have an awful lot of time to prepare this. I got roped into making a costume for my 5-year-old, and that used up a lot of the time. However, in the discussions on the WhatsApp group, which if you aren't on it, go and have a look, Larry was talking about the Messier Marathon. And so I went and had a look. That is a link to the Messier Marathon page with a mini, easier Messier Marathon thing you can do. Basically, how many Messier objects can you see in one night? So I thought I'd gather together a few items, some of the stuff that they mention themselves on this page, and a few others, and some that we've just got nice pictures for. So, reason this is mentioned, and I think the reason Larry was mentioning it, is March is a very good time for this. Things are positioned suitably, or about as good as they get for here. There are a few very southerly Messier objects you won't be able to see, or certainly not very easily, but there's a fair number that you will throughout the night. So of the weekends, I think it was saying the 14th, 15th, and around the 21st, they're the best times. So if we're looking here, that's the 21st of March, 8:15 in the evening. Suggested targets are those that will be going out of sight or too low. So in this instance, stuff that's around Orion, Canis Major, all that sort of stuff. In this instance, M74, the picture there from Horst, M93, again Horst. So globulars and open clusters. M45, which you could at the same time knock off your view of Uranus as you're doing it. And then a bunch of other big show items like M31, M33. So the suggestion from a lot of these things is find some nice, bright, easy to find objects and target those, and then target the other objects around them as you're doing it. If you are skilled, I'm sure you can do this with a finder scope and looking through the eyepiece. If you're like me, then probably using a Nina, you could put together a list of these items and have it slew between them, or even make a sequence, which I'm sure if anybody did make one, they could share with everybody else because it'd all be the same coordinates. And add a pause between each one if you've got a little flip mirror, or if you're targeting through the guide scope or finder scope, then that would work. Or of course, if you're using a smart scope, which I think is what Larry was talking about, then you should be able to look at those and go through them on your phone quite easily. Incidentally, if anybody is coming along to the next Wednesday's Imaging and Observing Group session, Larry is doing a talk on, and hopefully a demo on this very thing, the smart scopes using Nina, and I'm sure there'll be discussion around that and this for them. So moving later into the night, this is about 11:15. We've got a few galaxies targeting Leo at this point, and stuff around Gemini and Auriga. Again, just trying to get that stuff that might float off before we've had a chance to get it. There are obviously many more Messier items here. In fact, if you look on the Stellarium, you'll see with quite a lot of these, just glancing around, if you've got a wide field of view, you're probably going to get 2 or 3 in the same one. Which is precisely what happens here. So at this point, we are going into the early hours of the 22nd, 2 o'clock in the morning. We've got a shed load of galaxies. So, and a lot of them, like M81, 82, are all together. There's loads around Ursa Major, so you can have a field day there. And the green dotted oval there is Markarian's chain. So in that, you've got M84, 86, and 87. That's just in a cut down field of view. If you've got a sort of 70 mil F5 scope, something like that, you're probably going to get several others in there as well, around the M90s, that sort of level of, that sort of number. And then if you've made it all through the night, you're having a bit of fun. There's M16, M8, M20. They all are low but visible at this point and beautiful to look at. And also you've got favourites like M57, M13, M92, a lot of globulars. If you're after something that's easy to find with the eyepiece, then globulars or open clusters are a good target. And there's a lot of those in the Messier catalogue. The galaxies are visible, certainly M31, M33, you'll probably see. The others, you might see the central points of M51 and the cores of the galaxies if you're in a slightly darker place than my back garden. And I think I wanted to make this very quick. That's it.
Thank you, David. It sets a few challenges there, a few mini marathons. I can't remember the last time I got anywhere near a marathon. It's called Snickers now, isn't it? Okay. Slideshow. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this evening's presentations. Now we're going to take a look at what's coming up next. But first, I've got a surprise item. Before we get into coming soon, let's talk about what just happened. So I'll invite Andrew Farrow to come up and tell us what's just happened.
I remember how it works. Yeah, you probably remember back in January, I came across a Facebook article, a little video by Midlothian Libraries talking about cosmic explorers, and they got some funding from the council to take advantage of an offer by the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, where they're getting some material to take into schools. And I think they got 4 backpacks with some small kiddies type telescopes, 70mm aperture, Altaz, Bresser type things. And I saw this and I thought, well, this is an opportunity. So I rang them up and found Wendy Johnston, who was running the library support team, and Steve Harris was the man who was going to go into the schools. And I said, well, show me the material you've got, and is there anything we can do to help? The material was actually aimed at about 4 and 5-year-olds, I think, 6-year-olds maybe, and he was going to go into primary schools. So I thought, he perhaps needs some help. How to move this on? Right, so I put this up in on the 7th of January and said, this is what's going to happen. And what I did, I gave them some more material that I'd used with Scouts and Cubs they could use in the presentation, our planosphere, etc. And I said, well, why don't we come along and do a star party? And they were thrilled. So we began to lay some plans for a star party. And we said, yeah, we'll get a collection of scopes together, and maybe the children could bring some of their own. We could do it sooner rather than later. And there's some good targets. We ought to do it at night when the moon's available, because it's always a wow when you see the moon for the first time through a decent telescope. And of course, we set this to happen in February, and the great astronomical drought of 2026 started. But last Sunday, a window of opportunity seemed to be appearing. So on Tuesday, we decided to go ahead. So we chose, as we had done previously, Loanhead, school, health service, library, leisure centre, all rolled into one, and these 2 football pitches. There was the green at the top there, which is an astroturf and was floodlit. But given you're looking at the moon and Jupiter, you know, we can stand a bit of light, although it was rather a lot. So I sent a message to Steve on Sunday night. They'd put it on all the posters in the library. They'd put it on Eventbrite. They had 250 people sign up for it. Gulp. So when we cancelled it, he was able, when I reinstated it, to press a button, email everybody. Great communications. So what happened? Well, I rocked up and Paul brought his 18-inch kit, some kit, 18-inch Dobsonian. Ron brought his 12-inch Dob. I brought the ASE 10. Jonathan brought an 8-inch Dobsonian, and Neil brought his Christmas tree with the dwarf on top. John Briggs and Hugh Somerville came along, which was really useful to have people not with scopes, but to help manage the crowd. And so I got there early and I set up shop with a flag and the table. I use now QR codes because we're not scattering the field with paper, and that people can take an image of that. So information about the society, information about what they're going to see, that went down very well. So I got the 10 inches on the left. Ron brought this Canon on the right. He's just taken it off the carriage. And people started to arrive. And there they are, heading for the Christmas tree with a dwarf on top. And more started to arrive. I think that's the cue for your Christmas tree growing even more. And they began to enjoy themselves, got into the swing of it, and the crowds continued to grow. 300, we think, came along, a rough estimate, but looking at the queues, 50, 75 in each queue, and they were rolling in and out. So, a great response. Everybody enjoyed it. And they'd finish one queue and then nip round to the next. So it was really good. I did at one time think I'd move my scope from Jupiter and look at the moon. A delegation of people further down the queue came and put me right. So we stayed where we were. We've had a few responses from people who came there, and the library were absolutely thrilled by it. And there've been some more bits appearing on their Facebook page. So for me, it's what we do at our best. We're engaging with the public. You know, we're showing them and showcasing the sky and what's there. And the appetite is absolutely huge. It's just finding those opportunities, isn't it? So thanks for everybody who came and supported it. And those that would have been there, I know if the timing had allowed, it's not always convenient. I think you need the people and the scopes. You need a reasonable location, but you need the weather. And anybody who says that we're going to hold this in 3 weeks' time on the 7th is hopeful. I think having a window of opportunity and the good communications, you can turn it on at short notice, certainly doesn't stop people coming, provided you've got the good links. So we've learnt some things from this and from the Portobello one, which we did last year. We got over 200 people. And certainly what you point at when you start the evening is probably what you're going to be pointing at at the end of the evening. So getting people pointing in different areas and looking at different things. A few more smart scopes would probably be quite useful, given you're able to showcase things that they can't see visually. So we'll incorporate that into the guide that we're preparing, and hopefully we'll move from there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andrew. So a couple of specific thank yous from me for that event. First of all, to Andrew. That all started from him being proactive in contacting Midlothian Library, and that's where it came to. And my other thank you is to Hugh Somerville, who stopped me from being overrun on the night, because after 5 minutes of talking to the first person I spoke to, I looked up and could see the queue stretching all the way to the fence. And as if by magic, Hugh appeared at my shoulder and was able to work that queue to such an extent that when people did get to the front and got a chance to look at what I had and talk about it, they were still cheerful. So thank you, Hugh. That's a good point. Yeah. 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 Well, well, the irony of it was that earlier on in the day, I'd picked up these little crowd control barriers, and the intent was to put them round the smart scopes to stop people going up to them and trying to look through them, which the youngsters tend to do. But because we've only got the one smart scope, there's no point in getting the crowd control barriers out for one smart scope. Well, that was a big mistake. I won't do that again. So next time we'll get those out and surround the Christmas tree with some barriers. Well, I just had my phone, so I was just kind of showing my phone and so on. And no matter how many times I tried to get a smaller group and show, do the talk and show the screen to several people at once. People seem to be quite keen to stay in their family groups. So I wasn't particularly efficient at getting through the queue. So when the last person spoke to me, and that was great. Okay, I suddenly realised that 2 hours had gone past, and hadn't even cottoned on. So it was at that point I realised just how cold my fingers were. So it was a great night, and whoever organised the weather, thank you to you too. It definitely wasn't me. I still haven't got the hang of that. So big success, and there's lots more to come. Okay, let's look forward. So the rest of March, we have our mid-month meeting on Friday the 20th. Our guest speaker is Dr. Noel Castro-Segura, talking about binary stars and stellar cannibalism. And Noel says that stars are the building blocks of the universe. The majority of the stars in our galaxy spend their lives associated with a stellar companion bound by the gravitational pull between them. And the population of so-called binary stars encompasses up to 80% of the stars in the galaxy. Half of these systems have an orbital period short enough to induce mass exchange between the two at some point in their evolution. So in this talk, we'll review the basics of binary evolution and provide an overview of this phenomena observed in these systems. And also Noel will highlight how amateur astronomers such as ourselves and citizen scientists can contribute to the advancing knowledge. Moving to members and other events, David's already mentioned our Imaging and Observing Group, which meets next Wednesday. That's online for members only. Then the last week in the month is going to be a hectic week. On Monday the 23rd, Nigel and I are travelling down to Peebles to do talks to Tweeddale Astro Society. We have another outreach event, which will be of a different variety, a much smaller group at the House of Bins in West Lothian on Friday the 27th. So again, we'll have a mix of smart scopes and optical scopes. And then on Saturday the 28th, Brian is presenting at the British Astronomical Association Deep Sky section down in Cheltenham, and he's talking about his adventures in Auriga, which David also mentioned earlier. So I'm not sure if that will be recorded. I'll find out from Brian. Let's see if we can find out, unless everyone fancies a bus trip to Cheltenham. Okay, moving into April, our main meeting on Friday the 10th, so not the first Friday in the month because that's the Easter weekend, Friday the 10th, and it's members' night, so lots of members' talks happening. Nigel, have we got a full programme now, or are you still looking for? Okay, so anyone who wants to pop up here and talk about something, get in touch with Nigel. Our mid-month meeting on Friday the 17th, the online one, our guest speaker is Anwesha Sahu. She's a PhD researcher from the University of Warwick, and her talk is entitled White Dwarf Pulsars, the Best of Both Worlds. Pulsars and white dwarfs as individual classes of astronomical objects are well studied. Pulsars are remnants of turbulent supernova explosions. On the contrary, white dwarf stars form in calmer scenarios as a red giant star sheds its layers. Novel white dwarf pulsars are a little bit of both. And white dwarf pulsars are binary white dwarf systems which show pulsed emissions correlated to the spin period of the system. So Anwesha's talk will shed more light on these curious systems. And then in members and other events, our IOG is on Wednesday the 15th. And during the day on Friday the 17th, so again, that's a busy day for us, we'll be back at East Lothian down at Archerfield, following our visit down to Dirleton recently, taking part in the Wonders of Space event at Archfield, which is part of the wider science festival. So we'll be down there doing some solar observing with the public, and also the imaging and observing group images will be on display again, the ones that were on display at an event earlier. Finally, moving into May, Friday the 1st is our meeting here. Our guest speaker is Professor Ian Robson, a decorated professional astronomer who's very active in outreach and a keen presenter on astronomical topics. He summarises his talk as follows. Since the first use of telescopes in 1609, astronomers have made amazing discoveries about the universe in which we live. And technological improvements have meant bigger and better telescopes and novel instruments spanning the entire electromagnetic spectrum and beyond. And this talk gives an illustrated overview of the development and discoveries that have led to our current knowledge of the universe, and concludes with the onset of big data. So two of my favourite topics, data and astronomy, in one talk, in modern astronomy and the changing scene facing astronomers today. So that's called the changing scene in astronomy. Our mid-month session is on Friday the 15th, and our guest speaker is Dr. Krisa Avalidou, a lecturer in planetary science at the University of Leicester. And the working title of Krisa's talk is Meteorite Impacts on the Moon, and more details about this talk will be published as they become available. And our IOG session is on Wednesday, the 6th of May. All the information about these talks and events are published on the website as they become available, so make sure you keep visiting the website. And that seems like an excellent way to conclude the evening. Time for some refreshments, so tea, coffee, and biscuits at the back of the room. And if you're at home, you can pop the kettle on or open the bar. Thank you very much, and I wish you clear skies and a good night.